Before we start, I want you to know exactly what you're stepping into tonight. We're going back to Arkansas, early 1990s, to a patch of woods called Robin Hood Hills, where three 8-year-old boys left home on their bikes and never came back. We're going to talk about children, about brutal violence, without graphic details, but also about a justice system under pressure, a community in panic, and three teenagers who would spend nearly 2 decades behind bars for a crime many people believe they didn't commit. If at any point this feels like too much, hit pause. Take a break. Your mental health matters more than any story. Because this is not just a story about murder. It's a story about fear. About what happens when a community already on edge convinces itself that evil is hiding in plain sight, and decides that the weird kids must be responsible. And it all starts on a warm May evening in 1993, in the small city of West Memphis, Arkansas, right across the river from Memphis, Tennessee, where 3 little boys headed out for a bike ride and stepped straight into American true crime history. Imagine West Memphis back then. Working class, southern, deeply religious, part of what people call the Bible Belt. It's the kind of place where Wednesday nights are for church, where parents worry about their kids listening to heavy metal, and where rumors move faster than any patrol car. Nationally, the U.S. had spent more than a decade marinating in a very specific kind of fear, the Satanic Panic. Talk shows, news specials, and pastors were warning about supposed secret Satan-worshipping cults, child sacrifices, and ritual abuse. Most of it was based on bad science, false confessions, and pure hysteria, but at the time, it felt real to a lot of people. So when a horrifying crime hit a small, conservative, religious community, already primed to see the devil everywhere, the outcome was almost predictable. Almost. Before we talk about suspects, police, and trials, I want to slow down and talk about the 3 children at the center of all this, because too often their names get buried under the label West Memphis Three, and that label technically doesn't even belong to them. The victims were 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. They were second graders, Cub Scouts, the kind of kids who spent afternoons outside, riding bikes and playing in the woods. Friends described them as energetic, sometimes mischievous, but fundamentally just kids who trusted their neighborhood and believed they were safe there. Stevie Branch is often remembered as the more outgoing one, a bright-eyed blonde boy who loved his bike and his dog. Michael Moore was serious about Cub Scouts. Photos of him in his little uniform are some of the most heartbreaking images from this case. Christopher Byers, who struggled in school and had been prescribed medication for behavioral issues, was described as affectionate and impulsive. One of those kids who could drive adults crazy and then turn around and charm them with a hug a second later. On May 5, 1993, it was a Wednesday. It was warm. It was the kind of afternoon that feels endless when you're 8 years old and summer is just around the corner. Sometime after school, the boys started drifting out into the neighborhood. There were the usual rules: be back before dark, stay where I can find you. But this was a time and a place where kids roamed more freely than many parents would be comfortable with today. Neighbors later reported seeing the boys riding bikes, playing, moving in and out of sight like little satellites in orbit around their homes. At some point, all 3 ended up together, as they often did. Their destination would later become infamous: a patch of wooded area near a drainage ditch, known locally as Robin Hood Hills. As evening fell and dinner time approached, parents started expecting to hear the familiar sound of screen doors and small feet on the porch. Instead, minutes turned into an hour turned into frantic phone calls. And pretty soon what started as "Did you see Stevie?" became "No one's seen Stevie, Michael, or Christopher." The boys were missing. Parents began searching the neighborhood themselves, calling out their names, checking yards, peering down the streets. When they couldn't find them, they called the West Memphis Police Department. By around 8 or 9 p.m., officers were aware that 3 young boys were missing in the same area on the same evening. Some officers did search Robin Hood Hills that night, but the search was incomplete and limited by darkness. The official, intensive search would not take place until the next day. The next morning, on May 6th, the search resumed in full force. Police officers, volunteers, and family members combed the neighborhood. Attention quickly turned back to Robin Hood Hills, with its steep embankments and muddy water flowing through a drainage ditch. At around 1:45 p.m., a juvenile parole officer involved in the search spotted a child's sneaker floating in the water of the drainage canal. It seemed out of place, small, childish, and terribly alone in the brown water. When they pulled the shoe from the ditch, the truth started to come into focus. Police began dragging the ditch, feeling along the muddy bottom. One by one, they found the bodies of the 3 boys submerged, naked, and bound. Each child's wrists were tied to his ankles with shoelaces. The scene was chaotic, confusing, and deeply emotional for everyone there. Word spread quickly. 3 boys murdered and dumped like trash in a shallow, murky ditch in the woods. Within hours, rumors started. It wasn't just 3 boys dead. It became whispers of mutilation, of sexual assault, of ritualistic killing. Some of those whispers came from misinterpretations of early autopsy reports. Some were fueled by pure speculation and fear. Over time, experts would strongly dispute some of the more sensational claims, especially about supposed ritual mutilation, arguing instead that some injuries were likely caused by animals after death. But in May 1993, nuance didn't stand a chance against fear. A triple child murder in a small southern town is enough to destabilize a community, even in the best of circumstances. Add in a national climate soaked in satanic panic, and the pressure on police to solve this case quickly was enormous. From almost the very beginning, investigators were looking for something more than a killer. They were looking for a narrative. They needed this to make sense in a way that felt big enough, evil enough, to match the horror of 3 dead children. And in West Memphis, people already thought they knew where to look for evil. Enter Damien Echols. Damien was 18 years old in 1993, a skinny kid with long dark hair and a taste for black clothes, heavy metal, and Stephen King novels. He'd had run-ins with the law, a troubled family life, and prior mental health hospitalizations. In a deeply conservative town, he stood out. He read about Wicca. He talked about magic. He was openly different, an identity that, in that time and place, was practically a target on his back. Police interviewed a number of people early on, but their attention zeroed in on Damien pretty fast. There are conflicting accounts about exactly how and why he became their primary focus, but it's clear that within days, the rumor mill was pumping out a simple story: 3 dead boys, strange injuries, and a local teen who dressed in black and talked about the occult. Damien's 2 friends, Jason Baldwin and Jessie Misskelley Jr., soon came into the picture as well. Jason Baldwin was 16, quieter, and by most accounts, more easygoing than Damien. He liked heavy metal too, and he hung out with the weird kids, which, in this context, meant the poor kids, the kids in band t-shirts, the kids who didn't fit in the church-going, sports-playing mold. Jessie Misskelley Jr. was 17, from a very poor background, and had a measured IQ of about 72, mild intellectual disability. He struggled with comprehension and was very suggestible, something that would become tragically important. If this feels like the setup to a stereotype, the misfit kids get blamed. That's exactly the problem. Our brains are wired with what psychologists call confirmation bias. Once we've got a story in mind, we tend to notice and remember anything that supports it and ignore things that don't. In West Memphis in 1993, the story people expected was satanic cult kills children. Once Damien Echols was in their mental crosshairs, everything about him seemed to confirm their worst fears. But they still didn't have what they needed most: a confession, evidence, something solid. So they leaned on the weakest link. On June 3, 1993, police brought in Jessie Misskelley for questioning. Over the course of roughly 12 hours, with his father absent and no lawyer present for most of that time, Jessie was interrogated again and again. Only a tiny portion of that interrogation was recorded. The final part, when he finally began giving police the story they'd been trying to extract. The confession Jessie gave that day would become the backbone of the entire case. But from the start, there were problems. Jessie placed the murders in the morning, even though the boys were in school then and were last seen alive in the early evening. When police corrected him, he changed the time. He got details wrong about how the boys were tied. He described events that didn't fit the crime scene evidence. Each time he drifted off the facts, officers steered him back, correcting him until his story lined up better with what they believed had happened. To many observers who later studied the tapes and transcripts, Jessie's confession looks less like a spontaneous, truthful account, and more like a teenager with cognitive limitations trying to give authority figures what they wanted, so they would finally let him go home. But instead of going home, Jessie was arrested and charged with the murders of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers. He implicated Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin as co-participants. From there, things escalated quickly. Shortly after Jessie's confession, police arrested Damien and Jason. The narrative was set: 3 outcast teens, dabbling in the occult, had supposedly lured 3 little boys into the woods for a satanic ritual murder. There was no physical evidence tying them to the scene. No fingerprints, no blood, no hair, no fibers that clearly matched them. Later DNA testing of crime scene material would fail to link any of the 3 to the murders. But in that moment, police and prosecutors had what they needed: suspects, a confession, and a story the community believed. Jessie was tried first, separately from Damien and Jason. Because of something called the Bruton Rule, his confession couldn't be used directly against the other 2 unless he testified against them, which he ultimately refused to do. But that confession could absolutely be used against Jessie himself. At Jesse's trial, the prosecution leaned hard on his statement. They downplayed the inconsistencies and emphasized the lurid parts: the supposed beating, the bindings, the idea that this was somehow tied to satanic ritual. When you step back, it's important to remember that the most incriminating piece of evidence against Jessie came out of a long, unrecorded interrogation of a teenager with an intellectual disability, conducted by trained adults who already believed he was guilty. The jury convicted Jessie of 1 count of first-degree murder and 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 40 years. Next came the big trial, Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin together. If you think of a trial as a battle of stories, the prosecution's story here was dramatic, tailored perfectly to the Satanic Panic era. Damien as the ringleader, Jason as his loyal follower, and the murders as part of a dark occult ritual. The actual forensic evidence was thin, so prosecutors filled that gap with symbolism, aesthetics, and fear. They brought in an occult expert, a man named Dale Griffiths, whose degrees came from an unaccredited correspondence school, to testify that the way the boys were bound and the timing of the crime lined up with satanic ritual patterns. He pointed to Damien's interests, black clothes, heavy metal music, writings about magic, as indicators of dangerous occult involvement. In other words, Damien's identity, his taste in music and books, his teenage fascination with the dark and mysterious, were essentially treated as evidence of murder. Jurors heard about his mental health history, about his unconventional beliefs. They were shown photos and notebooks. They heard that he liked bands that sang about death and darkness. For a jury drawn from a conservative area, sitting in the peak of Satanic Panic, this painted a very particular picture. The defense pointed to a glaring issue. There was still no physical evidence linking the boys to the crime scene. No confession from Damien or Jason. No eyewitness placing them with the victims in Robin Hood Hills. They challenged the supposed ritual elements, argued that the wounds on the boys' bodies were consistent with post-mortem animal activity, and tried to frame Damien's interest in the occult as edgy teenage behavior rather than proof of murder. Years later, independent forensic experts would bolster the view that many injuries once described as mutilations were far more likely caused by animals after death, not by a knife-wielding satanic cult. But in 1994, none of that was enough. On March 19, 1994, Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin were found guilty on 3 counts of murder. Damien was sentenced to death by lethal injection. Jason, just 16 at the time of the crime, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many locals, it felt like justice. The killers of 3 little boys had been caught and punished. The devil, at least in this one small corner of Arkansas, had been defeated. But even then, cracks were forming in the story. From the moment of their arrests, Damien, Jason, and Jessie insisted they were innocent. Their families believed them. A small group of supporters began digging into the case and found a lot that troubled them. The lack of physical evidence, the flimsy occult testimony, Jessie's shaky confession, and the way alternative suspects and theories seemed to have been brushed aside or never fully explored. Over time, that small group of supporters turned into a global movement. One of the biggest turning points came in the form of documentaries, most famously HBO's Paradise Lost series, which pulled back the curtain and showed the world not just the crime, but the culture and the courtroom that produced these convictions. The films highlighted the poverty of the defendants, the way the town's fear of Satanism had colored perceptions, and the weaknesses in the state's case. The documentaries also humanized Damien, Jason, and Jessie, turning them from weird satanic kids into 3 very real young men facing death or life in prison. That kind of humanization taps straight into our empathy, and into what psychologists sometimes call the injustice response, our strong reaction when punishment doesn't seem to fit the evidence. Celebrities like musicians and actors began to speak out, raising money for appeals, hiring better lawyers, and bringing national attention to what had once been a small-town Arkansas murder case. Legally, though, change came slower. Appeals were filed and denied. Courts tended to defer to the original jury verdicts, even when new questions were raised about specific pieces of evidence or how Jessie's confession had been obtained. For years, the West Memphis Three sat in prison, Damien on death row in near-total isolation, while their lawyers tried to find a path back into court. That path finally opened up thanks to advances in forensic science. In the 2000s, DNA testing had become more powerful and more precise. Lawyers for the West Memphis Three filed petitions under an Arkansas law that allowed post-conviction DNA testing when new technology could meaningfully change the picture. The idea was simple. If there was biological material from the crime scene that didn't match any of the three men, that would strongly support their claims of innocence. When DNA from crime scene items was tested, none of it tied Damien, Jason, or Jessie to the murders. Instead, some DNA appeared to be consistent with one of the victim's stepfathers, Terry Hobbs, and a friend of his. It wasn't a slam-dunk smoking gun, and Hobbs has always denied involvement, but it was enough to make people look very differently at who might have been near those boys that day. Despite this, local courts were slow to grant relief. For years, judges refused to allow full evidentiary hearings on the new forensic findings. It would take an Arkansas Supreme Court decision in 2010 to order lower courts to consider whether the DNA results, along with other developments, might justify a new trial. By that point, Damien had spent almost 18 years on death row. As the possibility of a new trial loomed, something unexpected happened. The state and the defense started talking about a plea. What emerged from those negotiations is one of the strangest and most controversial features of this case: the Alford plea deal. An Alford plea is a peculiar legal mechanism in American law. In simplest terms, it lets a defendant plead guilty while still maintaining their innocence, acknowledging that the state technically has enough evidence that a jury could convict. It's named after a Supreme Court case, and it's controversial because it blurs the line between "we believe he's guilty" and "we just don't want to risk a new trial." In August 2011, faced with the risk of going back to trial in a county where they'd already been convicted once, and where Damien could, in theory, be sent back to death row, the three men agreed to Alford pleas to reduce charges of first and second-degree murder. The judge vacated their original convictions, accepted the new pleas, and sentenced them to time served, 18 years and 78 days. They walked out of prison that same day, technically free, but still, in the eyes of the law, convicted killers. For the state, it was a way to resolve a messy, high-profile case without admitting they'd made a mistake. For Damien, Jason, and Jessie, it was a way to escape decades more behind bars, or, in Damien's case, the constant threat of execution. For a lot of observers, it felt like a moral paradox. If they're guilty, why let them out? If they're innocent, why force them to plead guilty? This is where the human element of the justice system crashes into the legal one. From the outside, it's easy to say, if I were innocent, I would never say I was guilty. But imagine facing the possibility that the same system that convicted you once could do it again, knowing you've already lost nearly 2 decades, knowing the death chamber is not a hypothetical, but a real room you've seen pictures of. If you're given a choice between rolling those dice again or walking out the door today, a lot of people, especially after 18 years in a cage, take the deal. After their release in 2011, the West Memphis Three tried to rebuild their lives. Damien moved away from Arkansas, wrote books, and spoke out about life on death row. Jason focused on education and advocacy. Jessie lived a quieter, more private life. But the Alford plea meant they still carried the legal status of convicted murderers. They couldn't sue for wrongful conviction, and the state of Arkansas had no obligation to keep investigating who actually killed the 3 boys in Robin Hood Hills. For many supporters, that was unacceptable. The fight shifted from free the West Memphis Three to exonerate the West Memphis Three. Legally, one of the key battles in recent years has been over further DNA testing, using cutting-edge methods that are more sensitive than what was available even in the mid-2000s. At one point, a lower court denied a request for this advanced testing on procedural grounds, essentially blocking another scientific look at the evidence. But in April 2024, the Arkansas Supreme Court reversed that decision in a close 4-3 ruling, opening the door to new genetic testing of crime scene evidence using modern techniques. That ruling doesn't prove anyone's innocence or guilt by itself, but it means that 3 decades after the murders, the case is still not truly closed. There is still the possibility that DNA, carefully tested and interpreted, might shed new light on what really happened on that May evening in 1993. Meanwhile, alternate theories continue to circulate. Some point toward Terry Hobbs, the stepfather of Stevie Branch, noting the partial DNA match and allegations about his behavior before and after the murders. Hobbs has consistently and firmly denied any involvement, and he has never been criminally charged in relation to the case. Others, including Jessie Misskelley's former attorney Dan Stidham, now a judge, have suggested that the boys may have been killed by a passing serial killer who used major routes like Interstate 40 and the nearby truck stop as hunting grounds. In his 2024 book, Stidham outlines a theory involving a long-haul trucker and allegedly similar unsolved crimes, hoping that new DNA testing might one day connect the dots. And then there are those who still believe the original verdict, that Damien, Jason, and Jessie were involved, that the confession and circumstantial evidence were enough, and that the Alford plea was simply a legal technicality that shouldn't change anyone's mind. So after all this, where does that leave us? On one side, we have the original case, a confession from a vulnerable teenager taken after many hours of unrecorded interrogation, no physical evidence tying any of the three to the crime scene, a trial drenched in fear of Satanism and prejudice against nonconformity, and later scientific analysis that undercut claims of ritual mutilation and raised alternative suspects. On the other side, we have a community's lived experience of trauma, early statements and testimonies that some people still find compelling, and a legal record that, even with the Alford pleas, still says guilty. And in the middle, we have 3 dead children whose lives ended in that muddy ditch, and whose families have had to watch their grief become the subject of documentaries, debates, and internet theories. As I tell this story, I'm deliberately revealing it in layers. First the shock of the crime, then the context of the town and the panic, then the investigation and trials, and only later the appeals and alternative theories. That structure mirrors the way our brains naturally process complex events. First emotion, then facts, then analysis. Cases like this hook us because they tap into several powerful mental triggers at once. Fear for children, anger at perceived injustice, curiosity about what really happened, and that detective mode, where we feel like if we just hear one more detail, we might solve it ourselves. The line between healthy engagement and obsessive theorizing can get blurry really fast. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to invite you into a kind of thought experiment, not as a juror, but as a careful observer. Ask yourself, how much of the original case against the West Memphis Three was about evidence, and how much was about vibes, about how Damien looked, what music he liked, what books he read? If these same facts were presented to a jury today, in a world that's already had time to reflect on the Satanic Panic as a moral hysteria, would the verdict be the same? Or would jurors be more skeptical of an occult expert with unaccredited degrees and a confession taken from a teenager with an IQ in the 70s after hours of unrecorded questioning? How comfortable are you, personally, with a legal system that allows someone to walk out of prison only if they're willing to say the words, "I plead guilty," even while maintaining their innocence? And beneath all of that, the hardest question, if Damien, Jason, and Jessie didn't do this, then who did? Right now, we don't have a definitive answer to that question. What we do have are lingering doubts, new DNA testing approved but not yet fully reported on, and a tangle of human emotions, grief, anger, defensiveness, and hope, wrapped around a crime that happened more than 30 years ago. If future DNA results point clearly away from the West Memphis Three, and toward someone else, we may eventually see formal exonerations. If the testing is inconclusive, the legal record may remain exactly the way it is. 3 men technically guilty, yet living free, in a case that half the world believes is a textbook example of wrongful conviction. So was justice served in West Memphis, or did the system imprison the wrong men? Legally, the file says one thing. Scientifically and ethically, the picture is a lot more complicated. I can't tell you with absolute certainty what happened in those woods on May 5, 1993. No one can, not yet. What I can say is that this case reveals how vulnerable the justice system can be to fear, to moral panics, to stereotypes, and to the very human need to have someone to blame when something unbearable happens. Somewhere between the Satanic Panic of the 1990s and the DNA labs of the 2020s, there's a narrow path to the truth. Whether the system will follow that path all the way to the end, that's the part that's still unwritten. If you were sitting on a jury today, with everything you've just heard, would you vote guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? Or would you hold out and demand more? However you answer, I'd ask you to keep one thing at the center of this story: 3 8-year-old boys who never got to grow up. Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, Christopher Byers. Whatever we believe about the West Memphis Three, justice for them is still, even now, an open question.